Same old man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for June 4th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. I'm very excited to jump in to what many are hailing one of the best films of the year so far, but
Best Picture winner. This is going to win Best Picture, apparently.
Might be, but we're also joined by the great Christian Eulinberg for this review. Christian, It's been a minute. How you doing, my friend?
Hey guys, what's going on? Thank you so much for having me on. I've been busy, but blessed and just happy to be here.
Yeah.
Once again, talking about some Spider-Man.
Yeah. No, we're absolutely thrilled to have you anytime, but it's especially fun when this film comes out and you get a DM from someone who is extremely excited and wanted to be on this review, which is what happened with Christian. He DM'd me and was like, "Can I please be on the review for
That's
Spider-Man?"
the thing. For those of you listening, if you think we actually seek out guests for these reviews, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes we'll get people asking, "Can we be on your show?" It's like, sure, come on.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
We're inviting, we're welcoming.
Absolutely. So that makes this all the more exciting. So yeah, Christian, we're definitely happy to have you here for this. As I guess we get into this, obviously we're going to be talking about Spider-Man Across the Universe, taking film Twitter by Spider-Verse. Yes. There's too many multiverses going on right now. That's the problem.
It's true.
It is a universe, though, because of everyone. The universe is embracing this movie.
Yeah, all across the universe, the multiverse, Spider-Verse, whatever verse you want to go with. There's plenty to go around.
Yeah.
At any rate, that's the film that we're going to be talking about. And I guess before we get into it, though, I'm curious what your guys' expectations were, because 2018 Into the Spider-Verse comes out. It's one of the best animated films of that year, one of the best films of that year, period, by many. Did you go in with any sort of expectations, or were you just hoping that this was going to be a good middle movie because we knew that this is going to be the second of a trilogy? Where did you guys sit on it?
My gosh, that's a good question, because when this movie was originally supposed to release, I believe October of last year in 2022, then it got pushed back. I believe it was supposed to be around October. I could be mistaken on the date, but I do remember Across the Spider-Verse being delayed until this first weekend of June. But to answer your question, JD, I don't know what my expectations. I didn't know what my expectations were supposed to be. I guess for me, I was like, well, as long as it's as good as the first movie, I'm fine, because I actively did not read a lot of people's their initial reactions, because a lot of people have loose lips, and I just didn't want anything ruined for me. So I didn't know where my expectation level was going to be going into this movie. I was just like, okay, Lord and Miller, just show me what you got. It's been since 2018. The first Spider-Verse movie was an unexpected surprise. And I don't know, this one just really exceeded my expectations, and I was
always going right to it. You're going right into it.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Putting all the cards out already.
That's how I roll.
Guys, good movie.
But yeah, my expectation, just to dial it back a little bit, I'll save the rest of my excitement for later. But I didn't really know where my expectations were supposed to be, but I was thoroughly pleased. I'll just leave it at that.
I had no expectations. I guess I just had a couple hopes going into it. And a lot of that was really just due to the surprising success of its predecessor. Because of that surprising success, it's really easy for studios to just kind of ride on that high and do the same thing again. And that would have been a safe choice, but we've seen production companies kind of do that, right? We a lot of times when there is that success factor, you want to hold on to that. And really all I was hoping with this film, seeing that it was, I mean, still Lord and Miller tied to it, but it has a different directing team this time.
Yeah.
So, and we'll talk about that when we get into the movie itself and how it feels as a movie when compared to its predecessor. But I was really just hoping for something that felt like a different experience. And I'll simply say this. I think we got that. I do think we got that tonally and like emotionally speaking. It feels like a different movie in many ways, despite carrying a lot of the same aesthetic similarities. I don't want to get too ahead of myself yet as far as how I felt about the movie in general, but I do like that we get something that feels very, very distant from the tone and the mood of its predecessor and with different ideas on its mind. So that's what I was hoping to see going into it. Also knowing it's going to end on a cliffhanger because this was marketed as a part one. In fact, I think it was
public knowledge. Yeah.
It was originally called Across the Spider-Verse Part 1.
Yeah.
And then it was rebranded as just Across the Spider-Verse, with now Part 3 being titled Beyond the Spider-Verse. And honestly, I prefer that approach. And it's honestly an approach I really am secretly hoping that the new Mission Impossible ends up doing sometime in a couple weeks or months. That they just announce that, hey, this is actually just going to be called Dead Reckoning. Then a new title comes up for Part 2. It's like, I'm kind of sick of the whole Part 1, Part 2 thing, especially for movie titles that are as long as they are already and have these colons and separators already built into it. It's just like, what are you doing? You don't need to get this mile long with its title.
Sure.
So I do appreciate that they're at least trying to create a sense of distinction here. And I think they achieved that here for reasons we'll get into as far as how well it succeeds.
Yeah. I think additionally to what you're saying there, Brendan, because I was also curious how this would distinct itself from its predecessor, especially with this directing team here. But I also wanted to know, or perhaps maybe I was most curious as to how this would function as a part one, because I think that's perhaps where it could have stumbled the most. Is this going to be a setup for something else, which, was one of my biggest problems with the Fast and Furious movie that came out a few weeks ago. That whole movie is nothing but setup, right? There's nothing about it. That
I guess to call that movie a part one is almost disingenuous. It's part one to the part one.
Exactly. That's very much what it feels like. So what I was really wanting out of this film more than anything, because I expected the quality to be there given who is behind this movie and given the success of that first one, how was this going to function as a part one, as a bridge from what we saw in the first one to what we're getting in the third movie? Is it going to be a setup? Is it going to get bogged down in the multiversal angle of it? Or is it going to function as a really good movie that has its own identity that is distinctive, similar to Infinity War for me? Like, I love that movie because it functions as its own movie. It has its own ideas behind it. Thanos in that film is very different than the Thanos you get in Endgame. Endgame has its own identity that's separate. Or a Deathly Hallows Part 1, for example. That's another one for me. Deathly Hallows Part 1 is so different from Part 2.
That's true.
And that's what I was hoping for with this film.
This is not Breaking Dawn Part 1 or Part 2. It's not. In fact, it's not even Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2. Like,
I was just about to
that. Like, as much as I actually think Mockingjay Part 1 is pretty good. But like those movies, I feel like there was a possibility that they could have been conjoined in some way. Like they do feel like there is a like a tie between those in a more literal way than, let's say, some of these other examples that we're listing here.
Well, and I think that, it's interesting you bring up Mockingjay, because I think Mockingjay Part 1 is actually another very good example. Now, I don't think Mockingjay Part 2, a film I still like on the whole, does anything to distinct itself from.
I think that's the
one.
problem. It's less so on Part 1 and more so on Part 2, where the where that Part 1, 2-ism kind of fails a little bit.
Exactly. Like if Deathly Hallows Part 2 or Infinity War, like if those movies were just continuations of the previous movie, it's less on the Part 1s, if you will. That's more on the Part 2s, not going in its own trajectory.
All right, Beyond the Spider-Verse, it's your call.
So Beyond the Spider-Verse does have a little bit of pressure in that regard to not only continue this, but also,
stick the landing.
Exactly.
Needs to stick it.
Very, very well said. So that was really my other main concern, aside from a lot of the marketing here, obviously pointing to the multiversal part of it with all the various Spider-Mans that we're going to see. So my other question was, how is the film going to get bogged down by any of that and all of the cameos and references and gags as far as the multiverse goes? Like, is that a good thing for the film, or does it become a problem? That was my other big question. We'll get into whether the film succeeds in that, and spoiler alert, it does. But that said,
Like we're playing the cards already. We're not hiding anything. We're not holding back.
no, not at all. I mean, if you follow us on Twitter, I mean, you know where we're going here.
Good movie. Good movie.
All right, so Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. It is directed by Joaquin Dos Santos, Kent Powers, Justin K. Thompson. It stars Shamik Moore, Haley Steinfeld, Jake Johnson, Oscar Isaac. Mahershala Ali has a role here, and many, many, many more. Jason Schwartzman, I guess I should mention him, Issa Rae as well. We'll certainly get into all of these characters as this conversation goes. There's certainly plenty of them. We've already laid out our cards in some ways here, so let's just go ahead and jump into it. We'll start with you, Christian. What did you think about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse?
So, as a avid Spider-Man fan since I was about 5 years old, and I actually just got out of. I know. I actually.
I think many of us are in the same camp, right? I mean, like that was kind of our hero when we were kids.
Oh yeah. Well, when it came to like just anything, just superhero movie related, it was either X-Men or Spider-Man, or if you were lucky enough to see Blade, if your parents let you, there was that.
Sure.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. But as far as my initial reactions, without giving any spoilers away, because there's a lot to dig in this movie. I've seen it twice. I saw it Thursday night. That was like my, I saw it in a Dolby theater, like my first fresh pair of eyes. I was in such a high. I was like, wow, this movie is fantastic. Like, honestly, I believe it transcends as to just one of the best, like not just one of the best Spider-Man movies, but not just one of the best superhero movies, but just one of the best movies ever made, just in general. Like, I think there's a lot of things here that can be praised, not just for the comic book genre, but just for animation styles altogether and what's possible with animated films. But I just got back from seeing it today because I wanted to see it again just to see if this was just like a recency bias, like, oh, first time watch type situation. But I believe it was a better watch on the second time because, the first time, like we said, we know it's a part one and you're kind of like, you're along for the ride, but you're still interested to see where they're going to cut things off. And I absolutely loved it the first time. I think it was just as good, if not better, the second time because you're able to just sit back, relax, like you know where it's going. And it's the type of film that requires multiple rewatches because there was a few things that I didn't necessarily catch the first time, whether or not there's, there's a lot of jokes from time to time. So people are laughing at one joke that Miles or, I don't know, Peter B. Parker is saying, and then they're going on to something else and people are still laughing at something else because it's just that funny. Mm-hmm. But overall, like it's emotional. I know that a lot of people would say like, oh, I could easily see people say that, oh, I only like this movie, me, myself, I only like this movie because of all of the cameos, which is wrong. I mean, the cameos and everything that happens, all that's icing on the cake. But at its heart, this is a Miles Morales story. It is a Spider-Man story. And that's what I wanted. And that is what I got and more because it takes what Into the Spider-Verse has done. It takes everything that people love about that film and builds upon it. Excuse me. But also with, how it is with our sequel is better than the original. In this case, yes. But it's I have a lot more to say, but I'll save it as we go on. I don't want to ramble, it's just, but I absolutely loved it. Like I gave it 100% on our show.
Hot dang.
Seeing it a second time, I I love it. And it's not just like, it's not recency for me because I love Miles as a character. I love the attention that he's getting with, you know, the Spider-Verse movies and of course the video game aspect of it as well. And it's beautiful. It is amazing that this exists. It shouldn't work, but it does.
Yeah, you beat me to the punch a little bit there, Christian, because one thing I was going to ask you, as someone who has seen it multiple times, right? How well it holds up on that second viewing, and whether you liked it more in that second viewing, and whether you like it more than its predecessor because of that. Because I've only seen the film once, so I will admit I'm not ready to say like the M word for this movie or the fact that I like it more than its predecessor. At this point now, I still slightly prefer Into the Spider-Verse, and that's primarily because this new movie Across the Spider-Verse, it has a lot to offer. It's sometimes pretty overwhelming.
It is.
Can I ask you a question about that though, Brennan?
Yeah,
because when Into the Spider-Verse came out, you were initially mixed on it. Have you evolved your thoughts on that film?
Oh yeah,
over time?
I like that movie more as time has gone on, and I think maybe my initial reaction to that movie was more due to the like, I think in many ways the animation style, because it was so interesting and different. And if you're not used to that, and I don't think anyone was used to that, but if you're not really used to that, you're kind of distracted by it.
It can be a little jarring at first.
Yeah, which is why I'm really interested to see Across the Spider-Verse a second time, because so much does happen. And emotionally, tonally speaking, as we talked about, it's a very different movie when compared to Into the Spider-Verse. And I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of those tonal disparities, because I think they are very interesting. But yeah, like in the moment, so much happens that I can't say I loved it yet, because I need to pick up on a few more things that I may have missed. But at the same time, I have to at least say I respect this one more than its predecessor, because it's kind of a rarity to find pop entertainment like this that's really willing to challenge the audience, force us to try and pick up on little details like this film is offering, but also not afraid to challenge us emotionally, because this film does go into places that are kind of intense. Like, there is an intensity to this movie that I'm kind of surprised it got away with. At least in the third act, there are a few revelations, thematically speaking, that the film is addressing with regard to Miles Morales' his own history, and how he's sort of, I don't want to say to blame, but he's sort of tied to this whole multiversal topic, and then how that relates back to his family. I'll leave it at that for the sake of spoilers, but there's a challenging notion here that kind of deconstructs the whole idea of what a multiverse actually is, and whether there's a sense of control. There's an element here that's kind of reminiscent of the TVA from the Loki series. When we get to that third act, so it kind of argues whether this really is a multiverse, or if it's really just someone or some entity or some group really maintaining control for the right or wrong reasons. The way that is maintain has some really dire consequences when you think about it, and the film is not afraid to go there. And maybe that's the thing, because by the time the end credits started to roll, I kind of felt this wave of like despair, but I guess that means the movie's working. I guess I just wasn't really ready to sense that particular thing. So it's, when we look at Into the Spider-Verse, the predecessor here, it still feels and functions very much like a superhero movie in many ways. A very good one, not to knock it in that way, but it definitely feels like a Spider-Man movie, right? And it has the innocence that we love from a Spider-Man movie. Across the Spider-Verse is more reminiscent of something like Everything Everywhere All at Once. And it has some similar themes in the way that multiversal topics have this almost sense of universality to it. Like, these things are very comparable. But it has some similar emotional backdrops that I was very taken aback by. So I need to see the film again to see how well everything ties together and see some of these things I may have missed. But I do really like the film. I like it a lot, honestly, because it's not afraid to take chances, and it's also not afraid to be different. I love that it's doing that. I really do. So I have a lot of respect for it.
Well, I'm just going to jump right into it, because I'm with Christian. I'm ready to say that I wholeheartedly loved this film. It's without question one of the best films of the year so far. easily in my top 3, might even be my favorite film as I keep pondering it. There's so much to discuss regarding the writing and character work here, but
Yeah.
you'll have to forgive me as I transition into Jay Ledbetter here for a few moments, because my goodness, you could write full essays, theses will be written on this film on just the animation alone. This film is stunning to look at. Every scene oozes with evocative craftsmanship and assiduous care. The animation features so many art styles, with many of these characters embodying different artistic designs, whether it be inspired by old comic books or TV shows or movies. The varying types of animation and the way they're rendered, to me, is nothing short of sublime. And as if that's not enough, the visual design of the film isn't just clever and intuitive, but it's emotionally connected to the story and these characters. There's a scene, one of my favorite scenes of the film, really, and I'll be vague here to avoid spoilers, but there's a conversation between two characters, and there's some clear tension between them, which is reverberated in the animation with a murky aesthetic. The colors are more gray and dark. There's a dreary quality to it initially, but then suddenly there's an embrace between these two characters. And in a moment, instantaneously, the color palette switches to white and pink and these more vibrant hues. And there's
like
a redolence to how it all
watercolors.
crystallizes. It's incredible to watch. And I love how the film is willing to subvert its animation style to wherever the emotional pendulum swings. And that's one moment. Certainly there's plenty more like that throughout the film.
Yeah.
Many have pointed this out, but that moment between Gwen and Miles hanging upside down, it's one of the best Spider-Man visuals we've seen today. It truly is. I wholeheartedly agree with that notion. Very poignant, very evocative.
And just speaking of the animation there, sorry to cut you off for a second, because that moment in particular between Gwen and Miles, now I did not see this in 3D or even in IMAX. I saw this in a standard showing, and even that sequence gave me vertigo.
Yeah, sure.
So,
Yes.
so and it's not, and that's the artistry of this movie that I have to appreciate. It's not just the animation itself, which is, it's not just vibrant, it's very creative, and it often changes animation style, sometimes mid-second, right?
Yeah.
But it's also just the framing and the way it's composed and shot and balanced.
Yes.
That it has a sense of scale to it. It doesn't feel like a page out of a book.
100%. And that was going to be my next point regarding the animation. I completely agree. The vibrant hues and the variation in terms of the different artistic styles here, that in and of itself, I do think is incredible. As I mentioned, how it changes, how it evolves with the emotion of the film. It's all part of the nucleus that makes up this movie, and it's really great. But it isn't just that. You're completely right, Brendan. It is the scale, how moments like that can give you vertigo, or the way characters move here. It just gives you like a speed to the film, to a rhythm. Like you really feel these characters as they move about in these various spaces. And it does give weight to the action that does take place here. It's really fantastic. It truly is one of the best animated films I've seen to date, just in terms of animation. It's really great. And then as you're talking about, Brendan, thematically, there's a lot here in terms of not just the multiverse and how this film taps into what that really means, but when we get down to the lore of Spider-Man in terms of responsibility, I absolutely want to talk about how this film tackles that notion. I think it's really fantastic. The way it evolves Miles's journey here is really great. Of course, what we get at the end and how things are subverted, how it sets up what we're going to get later, I think is really great. How Gwen is a bigger part of this story. And what we got in the first one, I think, is fantastic. And in terms of the surprises and Easter eggs we do get here, I mentioned in my opening, or as we were setting up the conversation, does the film get bogged down in the Easter eggs and all of the Spider-Man references? I don't think it does. There
They're
are a lot
kind
of
few
them.
far between. There are a lot of them, but they come and go very quickly.
So fast. The film rarely. There are a few times where it pauses to let it linger, but mostly they're just there. And to what you were saying earlier, Brendan, in terms of rewatchability, like this is going to be a film where, because these references happen so abruptly, you have to like pause the film when it comes out on video.
This is gonna be the most paused movie of all time.
Yeah,
Someone's gonna make a YouTube video.
For that.
Yeah, which I love. Like I love that the film rarely slows down to, emphasize those Easter eggs and references.
Its goal is not to initiate an applause from an audience, right? And sometimes, like there are times we've seen popular movies try to emulate that type of response with regard to their fan service or their cameos. It doesn't always happen, but there are examples of movies that do that, and in some of those cases, it runs the risk of feeling disingenuous.
I agree.
Here, it's not doing that. It almost, in a way, it almost feels like it doesn't care as much about the cameos, but in a way it kind of does. Which I appreciate. It's more concerned about where the cameos are coming from as opposed to what the cameo is.
The cameos and the references or Easter eggs, however you want to label them, when they are emphasized here, primarily they're used for comedic gags, and I do think those jokes land. And then there's one that's utilized for an emotional beat, which perhaps we can talk about later, which I also think is done with diligence. So I to answer the broad question, I do not think the film gets bogged down in all of it. I think it is handled very well. The story and the themes here are very, very focused on what's at stake for Miles and Gwen and our central group here. And then the last thing I'll say, and then we can continue this conversation. Daniel Pemberton, if he is not nominated for an Oscar at the end of this year, I am going
What a score. Did he score the
incredible.
original?
Yes, he did.
He did? Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. The music to this film is absolutely astounding. It is easily one of the best scores of the year so far. I haven't stopped listening to it, and my God.
I agree.
I noted this on Twitter earlier today. I will be championing the living hell out of this score when it gets to the fall, and I'm going to be severely heartbroken when he's not nominated for an Oscar.
Well, he's doing a lot of the work,
so
right? I mean, you think about it. And I'll say this, and I'll let you come in, Christian, because the whole final 40 minutes of this movie feels like constant climax. Like it's almost like you're ready to stand up and just stand in awe. And a lot of that is because the score is just so consistent, and it keeps building to this like legit emotional payoff by the end. So it does add this sense of like immediacy to it. So the score is very important. I agree with you, JD. It's a really great piece of music from Pemberton.
Yeah, it is. It's like, I mean, what you're saying, within the last 40 minutes, it's like so much happens. Like you guys have been saying, does it get
You're almost out of
down?
breath by the end of it. The movie's a workout. You got to put a workout on your Apple Watch to watch this movie.
It's one of those movies where I wish if there was some type of way for me to turn back the hands of time and to experience this movie again for the first time. Because the first time I saw it, it was in Dolby Theater Thursday night. That's like when like a lot of the fans come out, but like it was this rush of like emotion. It made me like, I'm a big Spider-Man fan, but like it made me an even bigger Spider-Man fan, which I didn't think was possible. Because it's just like, he's my guy. Like whether it's Peter, Miles, Miguel, or Hero, whoever it is, it's like, that they are Spider-Man at their core. But when it comes to just like the final 40 minutes, it's like that's, it's a part one. So there's obviously a cliffhanger, and it's like, I knew that going in, and I was just like, oh my God, like that was beautiful. And I was like, I wanted to keep watching, obviously. But it's like, we got to wait a year, which is fine. But it's like, man, the fact that we don't know what's coming.
But here's the thing. It doesn't, to me, at least, what I love about it is that it doesn't really feel like a quote unquote part one to me. Like,
no, it doesn't.
To me, it feels more like a part two in a trilogy, which is what it should feel like.
Exactly.
Like there are many times you'll see a movie franchise or at least an initial movie turned into a trilogy. And what it ends up feeling like is, okay, there's that first standalone movie, and then
And
there's
then there's
a second and third movie to make a trilogy when those final two feel like that they should have just been one movie or something
Yeah.
like that.
yeah.
I think of the Hobbit trilogy, for instance, which
Yeah.
like, there's no reason that should have been a trilogy. And
Yeah.
really the big problem is parts 2 and 3 feel like they could have just been one movie and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
That was
that's
the original plan.
I know. Well,
Yeah.
that's what it should have been. And you could see where the seams were breaking. But
Yeah.
Big time. Yeah.
while this does feel like, I mean, not feel, but while this does maybe have the element of a part 1, that's how it was just marketed to us initially.
Right.
Yeah.
But it really feels more like a part 2 of a 3-parter, which is what it should be. And I love that about it.
And also when you're going like what I love about this movie is how closely it ties to the first film. Because now I can go back and rewatch Into the Spider-Verse and knowing obviously, you know, the big twists and turns that we get from Across the Spider-Verse, now going back and rewatching this, like maybe like on a yearly rewatch, you obviously you know where these characters' journeys are going, but there's subtle things that it's like, oh, this is where that happens, or oh, this is what they meant by that. Because there's a lot of things where you're like, oh my God, I love how much this ties into the first movie. Because originally Into the Spider-Verse wasn't marketed as a trilogy. It was just one movie.
Yeah.
You know, Sony was, I would say at the time, maybe 60-40 when it came to Spider-Man stuff, because we had like the beginning of the Tom Holland live action, but like, you know, Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. I don't think Venom came out by that time. But also Spider-Man 3. Sony didn't necessarily have like the best track record outside of the help with the MCU for Tom Holland.
Oh, yeah. They didn't know how to handle Spider-Man for a while.
No.
Yeah.
And, you know, when the first movie came out, it's like, you know, Miles Morales was, I believe he was originally conceived, I think it was like 2009, 2008, maybe 2010. I can't remember. But
Yeah, he's a recent character. He was
he's very recent.
It may have been 2011. It may have been as late as that.
Yeah, and it's, you know, from the first movie, we didn't expect this to turn into a trilogy. But the fact that I think that Lord and Miller and everyone else who was involved with this made sure it's like, okay, we're gonna make, you know, a second movie because the first one was so well received. Obviously, won Best Animated Feature at the Oscars in 2019, deservedly so. But it's like they took time with this movie. And I was a little bummed that he got pushed back, but I was like, you know what? It's going to be worth the wait. I knew that much. And I just love how everything is everything's blended and welded together. It doesn't feel like, oh, well, you know, they changed a few things from the first in order for it to make sense in the second movie. It's like, no, everything just flows together like water running down a stream. And it's beautiful.
Yeah.
August 2011 for the record.
2011.
Saw Miles Morales. I want to talk about the script to this film real fast because I think it's really great. I really love the writing to this film. I love how moving it is at times, much like its predecessor. I mentioned earlier we get more with Gwen, and I love seeing her as we do in the opening of the film on her home world. The dynamic there with her father, I think, is fantastic. Similarly, there's plenty to Miles and the complex dynamic he has with his parents as he struggles to keep his Spider-Man identity a secret. Again, not going to go into too much detail, but as that evolves, as that pendulum keeps swinging, and there's certainly a couple of scenes we could certainly talk about, but the way it somewhat crystallizes as we transition to the back half of the film with that monologue from Miles's mother as it's depicted in the trailer, in that first trailer, I believe it was, where she's talking about her little boy and wanting Miles to take care of him wherever he goes. That is so affecting in context of the film. And of course, it becomes a big pivot point to how things end up in those final moments. But even outside of the emotion, there's so much fun to be had with this film. It's fast paced. Once again, it throws a ton of information at you. There's 10 jokes a minute, as you mentioned earlier, Christian. There's a lot of Spider-Man lore here. I found all of that pretty seamless, really amusing oftentimes. I do think that maybe at times the script might not wholly trust the audience. It does remind us of things from that first film.
Right.
Some of that, though, I do think is an artistic choice. I think there's purpose to it. Some of it is playing catch-up duty, assuming that you don't remember everything from the first film, or maybe you didn't even see it. There's one major plot point, not going to get into it for spoiler reasons, that I have questions about as far as
I think I know what you're talking about but
here. Yeah. But again, to be fair, that's something that the third film could answer. So that's why to me, it's just a question. Those are small. I don't even want to say criticisms. They're just little things that I don't think are a hindrance to this film at all. Mostly the writing here, I think, is really, really, really good. We mentioned the cameos and the references that we get here. All of that is really fantastic. But it's also interesting to consider the choices that the characters make and how that tethers to Spider-Man lore regarding responsibility. We all know Uncle Ben's line. It's part of the nucleus of what makes up who Spider-Man is. Yeah. And this is a film that aims to deconstruct that a little bit when you consider fate and how the timeline is connected by tragic events. I'll say as vaguely as I can. Does responsibility mean looking at the larger picture and making sacrifices? And if so, does that change how we view the meaning of Spider-Man? These are questions that this film tackles directly, and I think it is engrossing to see how it all starts to play out. Oh, and ending somewhat abruptly. We're certainly going to get the answers to those questions in the next film. But I do like how this film with Miles, how the cliffhanger tethers to those questions. You noted earlier, Brendan, that it's a little daring in that regard. Yeah. Man, the writing and how it taps into that, the complexities at play, truly some of the better writing I've seen in an animated film in some time.
Yeah. Well, we see in a lot of Spider-Man properties, and not even just Spider-Man, we see this in a lot of movies in general with regard to superhero movies as well. This notion that like tragic events are what shape us, right? And that's kind of what provides this sense of growth and responsibility to overcome that adversity, right? But there's also the question that this movie raises, that what if that's, for lack of a better term, what if that's kind of bullshit, right? What if you what if you can learn responsibility in a different way that still kind of breaks the timeline a little bit and maybe causes severe ramifications. So that's where I think the film is kind of daring, and I'm really interested to see how Beyond the Spider-Verse is going to tackle that. It just creates this question that, do we need to maintain the same trajectory across multiverses in order to achieve the same goal? And this is why I compared it to something like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which was a movie all about showcasing these different timelines, these similar variants of these characters, but it was kind of like this everything bagel that tied everything together regardless, right? That despite their different circumstances and different settings, they still kind of dealt with the same emotional problems, the same familial problems in a very broad sense, right? And this movie is kind of doing that. It literally calls it the canon. It's a little blunt with that, calling it the canon. So in some ways, it's kind of addressing toxic fandom in some way. But they call it that. And if you break away from that, the lore of what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man, does that cause an issue? And maybe it shouldn't. Or maybe it should. I like that's kind of interesting.
And I think what's really fascinating about that, and what we see here with Miles, and how the film taps into what is arguably the defining trait of Spider-Man as it relates to having your cake and eating it too, which is what I love about the cake gag at the midway point of the film, where Miles brings home 2 cakes.
I wonder if that was deliberate. Now that you say that,
I think it does.
My gosh,
I think it
party, they're kind of ruined. It's quintessentially indicative of that Spider-Man dichotomy of being the hero and attempting to have some sort of personal life, which is often messy. But Spider-Man is a character that always tries to have it both ways, with Spider-Man saving the children and Mary Jane as a primary example. However, it's that same ethos that often leads to the emotional complexities of the character. When you consider Gwen's death in Amazing Spider-Man 2, or his inability to save MJ and Ned's memories in Far From Home.
Exactly.
And now with this film, it's how having your cake and eating it too will destroy many more lives because of how it'll disrupt the multiverse. Man, it's one of those things where you do understand, I think maybe even more so than what we get with the TVA and Loki, why these Spider-Man characters are a little bit tied, a little bit,
tethered,
stuck by their own webs, if you will, within the multiverse, and why it functions the way it does, because it is the core part of what makes Spider-Man who he is. But on the other side of that coin with Miles, having your cake and eating it too, that is also a defining trait of the character. And when it comes to him writing his own story, which is another big thing for Miles, man, boy, that combusts here in such compelling and captivating ways.
If that doesn't teach you responsibility, then I don't know what does. I mean,
Yes.
Uncle Ben, I love you, but your death means nothing compared to those problems. I mean, it's like that is severe, and to put that on a child, I think that's why the film has this sense of, I use the word despair, which might be a bit too harsh of a word, but it's a word I still relatively stand by.
It is dire. You mentioned dire, and I think that is an appropriate word.
Yeah, because that level, that burden that you're talking about is being put on the back of a child, essentially, a teenager, really. And that is kind of felt. So that's daring for a movie like this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. There's so many possibilities. Like, well, what JD was just saying, like all these instances, what we've seen with Spider-Man, whether it be Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, Tom Holland, obviously more recently with the death of Aunt May from that movie. If you haven't seen it yet, I'm sorry, it's been out forever. Not forever, but for a long enough time.
Sure.
But when
I mean, a couple weeks is forever movie time now, right?
I know these days.
Yeah, but it's it's always Spider-Man is always faced with a choice. Even with Tom Holland, do I keep, my identity's out? Do I keep it the way it is for the sake of the multiverse crumbling, or making that sacrifice? And even Spider-Ham said it in the first film, that the hardest thing about this job is that you cannot save everyone. But the fact that Miles is trying to push back on that and says, I can do both, because that is what Spider-Man should be able to do. And it changes things. And I like how we get that notion, like, okay, well, does it have to be this way? Because a lot of people always joke about, why is it that every single superhero has like a tragic moment happening like in their life when it comes to like the death of a parent, or like they're just automatically like orphans? Like we see with Miles, especially in this movie, that he has two very loving parents, and they don't canonically, obviously, when it comes to Miles's story, if I won't say anything just for the sake of the movie, but certain events do happen in his life that that kind of mirror everyone else's tragedies. But with this version of Miles, it's not only just Miles has both of his parents, he's living life good, he's Spider-Man, everything is sunshines and rainbows. But also it's like it's hard to explain. I guess what I'm trying to say is, when it comes to Miles having that outlook on things, and that how he loves his parents so much, it kind of puts him in a different perspective. So he's like,
sure,
I can do everything because it falls on my responsibility. I had a point, and I do apologize, but it literally just like flew out.
Well, I can
I see where you're going with that, though.
Yeah, I can certainly jump off that, because I think what's fascinating with Miles and what you're saying there, and this larger conversation of the choices he makes, how that's counterintuitive to the Spider-Man web that's been woven within the multiverse in these two films. I think it's interesting to point back to, and you noted this earlier, Brendan, that he is essentially a child. So when considering
15.
his innocence per se, I think so much of it comes down to that. As a teenager who hasn't experienced the world in ways that these other characters have, I think that innocence has become a crux that he has started to lean on. And morally speaking, it certainly has given him this vibrant exclusivity comparatively to everyone else who is either much older than he is, or in the case of Gwen, her experiences have been a little bit harsher to her. So it's made her a little bit more rugged. But I think of a couple of things with Miles in that specific regard. One, the reason that he is afraid to tell his parents who he is, it is different from the conventional Spider-Man, or even if you want to look at it more broadly, the superhero ethos of, I can't tell people that I love because I need to protect them. If people know who I am, those that are out to get me, they'll go to them first. That is not Miles. Miles is afraid to tell his parents the truth because he's afraid they won't love him anymore. That's what's driving that choice.
Simple.
And it's that simple. And I think that comes back to maybe not naivete, maybe that's a little bit of it, but just that innocence, that youthful vigor of Miles. And then I also think about how maybe he isn't old enough to experience something like what we see with Peter B. Parker in this film, or even the Miguel character played by Oscar Isaac, who I love in this film as well.
Yeah.
What's interesting about Miguel or Peter B. Parker is they have experienced those heartaches. They've experienced the harsh realities that come with making decisions within the multiverse and what the dire consequences of that are, which is what, has created this TVA-esque organization that they're a part of now. It's not from a place of villainry. It's from a place of, I've made mistakes in my youth, in my innocence, that cost the lives of so many others. So Miles, he doesn't have that perspective. So his morality, the choices he makes, comes from that simple innocence. And it makes him so distinctive from everyone else. Now, at the same token, because of those choices, there is a twist at the end of this film we won't get into that sort of deconstructs that a little bit. Now, it's not entirely his fault.
No,
which is why I think the third film is going to get into that a little bit more, but I just find the weaving of all of that here, that innocence and how that defines Miles, man, it's so compelling.
I think part of it too, and this is something the film kind of gets into, it's not that literal with it, but I do think it's absolutely on its mind, especially considering that you do have Miguel O'Hara as Spider-Man 2099 here.
Yeah.
And again, like, they're not of the same ethnicities, but I do think ethnicity does play a part into this. Because we get a lot more with Miles's mother in this one, and it is directly stated that she is Puerto Rican. Like, that's actually mentioned in the beginning of this movie. We knew that from the first movie, but she wasn't much of a character in the first movie. It was really more about Miles's relationship with his father. But this one's really more about his mother. She has a lot more to do in this one. Yeah. And I do think that there maybe is this indirect messaging of the burden and responsibility that Miles faces because of his ethnicity. At one point, that twist that you're talking about there, JD, that we do get in the third act, I don't want to give it away, but it does lead to this term of calling Miles a quote-unquote anomaly. And I think in doing so, it kind of creates this almost like this insult of sorts because of that. And maybe it's an indirect thing, but I think that kind of creates this even further level of responsibility, tying all of that together even further. And, the fact that you have Miguel O'Hara here, who I believe is Irish Mexican. I don't remember his exact ethnicity, given the history of the comics, but the film does have ideas on its mind with regard to heritage and where you come from, literally speaking. And I do think that's at least pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that goes both ways, and
Sure.
that I think is effective to this film, because even if you remove that, I think just the external or the instinctual motivation of those characters, emotionally speaking, and if you want to dive even further with Miguel and with Peter B. Parker, a lot of it now also comes down to fatherhood and wanting to be a father and
Yeah,
wanting
maybe.
to protect that at all cost, and knowing that if you disrupt that, that will be taken away from a lot of people. But what's interesting about Miles' choices here, and I am glad that you brought up that he is this anomaly, and yes, it is brought up as a term antagonistically from
Yeah.
Miguel's perspective, but it's also this interesting praise of Miles that I think is an interesting identifier that parallels the first film and continues on into this film, right? Because the whole thing with Miles and with the first film and now into this one is that the story of Miles Morales is about subverting the Spider-Man trope.
Right.
Right? Like, it's about, I'm going to be my own thing. In the first film, it's, I'm trying to be Peter Parker. I'm trying to be Gwen. I'm trying to be all of these other Spider-Men that are trying to help me out, and I can't be them. And in the end, I have to do me. I have to make my own choices. And that becomes, the crux of the third act of that movie. And then into this film, that very much continues. So him being an anomaly is what makes him a compelling character, even if the innocence that's driving that character, that might end up, causing some ramifications at some point. I'm curious to see where that goes into the third film. But as far as how that affects who he is and the dramatic urgency of the character as a result, I think from a storytelling perspective, it's hypnotizing. It's fantastic stuff.
Yeah. There's a lot of twists and turns, and even with we've talked about the parentage, like fatherhood, but like I think this is a good film for parents overall, just because you see
Agreed.
within the film that Miles's parents, they're just trying, like everything they do is for him, and they're trying to figure out their son. Is he in love? Why is he always I guess, going against their wishes and whatnot. And obviously we know the reason to that, but he is struggling with a lot. Like JD has said, the reason why Miles is afraid to tell his parents is because he feels as if they will not love him the same. And it's like, it's this whole mix of emotion. You see Miles' father just, he's like, I don't know what to do. He's like, I see this spark in my child. He says and does these amazing things, but then it's like, it's like two steps forward and then one step back kind of thing, where it's like he sees these amazing things, but he doesn't really know what's going on with his own son because of everything that the Spider-Man business side. But it's a very complicated relationship. Obviously this film leans more with his mother, and I like that, how we get to see both sides of his parentage kind of play out within these two movies.
Yeah, those conversations they have early on, as I noted, I love how affecting they are.
It's amazing.
Funny at times as well.
Oh yeah, that first moment with his dad. Yeah, when they're first fighting the Spot together.
Yeah,
and they have that conversation together at the end. It's it's definitely played for laughs. I think it earns those laughs, but there still is a tender quality to it.
Oh yeah, you just gotta spread your wings and fly. It's crazy stuff. Gotta spread your wings, man. Spread your wings. Yeah.
Another character I loved in this film, kind of, for detouring a little bit here, is Pavitr. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he was incredible. I love the humor. And speaking of innocence, this is a character that certainly hasn't experienced anything harsh either. In fact, what we come to find out in this film is that he was supposed to have his tragic event here. Now, for spoilers, I won't go beyond that. I'll just say that there is a pivot point where that is halted slightly. I'll say it at that. So the character and how he is reverberated here is youthful. He has this spirit. He's only been Spider-Man for like 2 months or whatever he says. So, you know, like he's very new to being the character, but he has the bracelet, which Miles doesn't have. I thought that was a funny little gag as well.
Yeah,
and coming from in a coffee background, it's an industry that I work in. His joke about chai tea. TT is so good. I love that so much.
Yeah, that's a great character. Who else is here? There's a Hobie. Spider-Punk.
Spider-Punk is awesome.
Who, like I was listening, like, oh god, I know that voice. Oh, that's Daniel Kaluuya. So I love that. We don't get much of Peter B. Parker in this one, which was a little unfortunate.
Yeah.
Still memorable though. I still love Jake Johnson though.
I do too.
Yeah, he really just comes up in the final act where he's most required. I will say, if there is any, I guess, not a criticism, but if there's something I wish the film would have at least given us was at least some of Spider-Man Noir and Spider-Man.
I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're kind of in the movie, but John Mulaney and Nicolas Cage are not.
Right.
Now, without getting too in the weeds into spoilers and plot developments, I'm guessing they're going to have a pretty big part in Beyond the Spider-Verse.
Yeah. I'm assuming so.
Yeah, but it would have been nice to see them, back here again and watch Spider-Man Noir play with his Rubik's Cube a little bit more.
We get a bit of Penny Parker, like a bit.
A very, very minor
very
moment.
brief.
Yeah.
But I do agree. But I am assuming they're going to be a part of Beyond the Spider-Verse. Kind of bring it full circle.
Yeah, they'll be a big part of it.
Yeah. One thing I also want to say, as we're on the subject of some of these supporting characters, and this is something I think this film vastly improves on with regard to its predecessor, is the villains of this movie are so much better than Kingpin from the first movie. And I didn't hate Kingpin from the first movie, voiced by Liev Schreiber, but I love Jason Schwartzman as the Spot here. And it's something we kind of talked about not too long ago, JD, on our Disney Renaissance power ranking. When we were talking about Beauty and the Beast specifically, I mentioned how refreshing it was to have a villain like Gaston actually be funny. Right? Like, we don't see many villains that are just hilarious.
The Spot is that. He's very good in this.
But he's also frightening. Like there, and a lot of that is, again, the animation being as inventive as it is. There are sequences involving Spot that are kind of nightmarish. But again, like when he's introduced, you think he's just going to be a jokey villain of the week, and that's not
how
what
they describe
happens.
him, right?
But they subvert those expectations as well. He's really great here.
No, he definitely comes off as maybe a little gimmicky, or that he's some sort of silly antagonist. And I do love how
the way he describes his holes.
It's so good.
I just kicked myself into myself.
Love that. Yeah, no, and even with the whole ATM thing, it's very playful, and that whole opening fight sequence between him and Miles, the film does treat that whole sequence as if this is just a hiccup along our way to a bigger story. Yeah, and it doesn't, like, the film doesn't seem to be interested in the Spot as being one of the bigger characters of this story initially. I do like how it kind of underplays that a little bit, and treats it as if he is the joke of the week.
He may have the greatest villain origin story I've ever seen in a superhero movie. And it's the way it ties to the movie's predecessor, the way it ties to Into the Spider-Verse. I don't really want to give it away. Like,
no. Yeah. It is funny.
That is one of the greatest origin stories to a villain I think I've ever seen.
It's so good. And again, maybe this is giving it away a little bit, but a tie-in to Everything Everywhere All at Once. I'll just say.
That's another reason why I brought up that movie. It's not just comparable in a thematic and narrative sense, but in a delicious breakfast kind of way.
It's so good. Love that.
It's just, I love, like I said, I love how everything they thought of everything. They're like, okay, if this is going to be a sequel, this needs to be as airtight as it possible. When you're dealing with the multiverse, everything is, you kind of just have to take it for what it is. Like, but obviously it needs to be explained in a way for people to understand. But yeah, I again like it's those small little details of how the spot ties into Miles. Um, it really just it's like they thought
Yeah.
of everything. They're like, oh,
Yeah.
Well, and that's to me, I think that is the brilliance of this film because
mhm,
we've talked about the humor, we've talked about the drama, the thematic complexities of this film, Miles's journey. We raved about the score, and I started off my opening thoughts by iterating that I think full essays will be written on just the animation
I
alone
agree.
in this film and the texture to the film in that regard. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the entirety of this film, every little component, the craftsmanship is it's astounding. It's truly one of the most breathtaking experiences I've had in some time. With that, though, let's go ahead and transition to final thoughts. I guess we'll go back to you, Christian. Do you have any concluding thoughts here on Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse?
I just hope people go watch it. And I will say for people who have not watched the first film or going into this movie, because I would say that like obviously like I would recommend people to see the first one and then see Across the Spider-Verse. But when I went today, I had taken my roommate who has never seen the first movie. I was trying to get him to watch it beforehand, but we just didn't have time. But
Okay.
he still loves Across the Spider-Verse. Obviously, there are a lot of callbacks to the first movie that kind of went over his head, but you know, he was asking me about them afterwards. But he was even more interested to go back and watch the first Spider-Verse movie. So I think that this movie does work, not necessarily as like a single standalone, but if you're wanting to go see this with a bunch of your friends and you don't have time to go watch Into the Spider-Verse, you may be a little lost on a few references here or there, but I still think
Mhm.
that you will enjoy the film. But overall, I love this movie. It just, you know, it doubles, triples down on, you know, what it means to be Spider-Man and you know, asks the question, you know, well, do things have to be this way? When it comes to responsibility, what does that look like for Miles Morales? And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's just beautifully done. I
Yep.
am glad that, you know, we waited a decent amount of time and we won't have to wait too much longer for Beyond the Spider-Verse, but I just think it is a fantastic movie. One of my favorite movies of all time. I've seen it twice and just
Nice.
a job
Nice.
well done to like literally all of the cast and crew, everyone who
Uh-huh.
worked on this project, because like JD said before, like the writing is
So
immaculate, it's
good.
fantastic, but like the
Sensational.
animation alone, that could not have been easy for everything that they did. It's like I'm like, how is this possible?
And this movie has a budget of $100 million, which isn't low. It's the same budget as the Super Mario Brothers movie,
Mm,
but there's such an inventiveness and a weirdness to it. You would think it was more expensive than that.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
given the weekend that it had, it's clearly going to make its money back, which
Yeah.
is
yeah. Some
a good
things look
thing.
hokey, but it's like it just works. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, and when it looks
It's
hokey,
weird.
it's supposed to look hokey.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything's deliberate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Good stuff.
I think what's exciting about this movie, and I will say, you know, this conversation has made me like the film even more. I'm sure when I see the movie again, I'll probably end up saying it's probably the second best Spider-Man movie ever made, just behind Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2.
That's what I
I'm
said.
Yeah,
Oh.
I wouldn't be surprised if I end up in that camp. I'm not quite there yet. I'm still, I mean, but it's still of the 10 Spider-Man theatrical films that we've gotten, not
Right.
including Morbius and the Venom movies, just the
We
10.
don't count those.
Yeah, the 10 titular Spider-Man theatrical movies.
Right.
This is still one of the great ones for sure. I think the most exciting factor of the film for me is it's creating a certain buzz that I'm missing from pop entertainment movies these days, right? And it happened when Everything Everywhere All at Once premiered, or Top Gun Maverick premiered last year, right?
Mhm.
Like when those
Mhm.
movies came out, it just created this buzz, this surprise that didn't let up. I mean, it made a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. And I'm starting to see some pieces from certain publications out there that think, is this going to be the first animated movie that carries more legs than we think? I don't know. And I'm not saying I think it is, and I'm not trying to jinx it. I mean, when we said this about Everything Everywhere when that film came out, we thought there's
about
no
this
way
time, right? Or
yeah,
ish.
I think it was even more like April.
Yeah, I think it was earlier. Yeah, it was even earlier. Yeah.
But even then, we were thinking, "There's no way this movie is going to be a Best Picture nominee." And look what the hell happened.
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
There's going to be a time an animated movie is going to break the mold. Like, it's going to happen at some point, I think. I'm not saying I think it's going to happen with this one, but to see people say that it could, and the fact that there is this almost universal embrace of it. I mean, like, our good friend Jay Ledbetter, who is so cynical when it comes to superhero movies, loved this movie. He compared it to Speed Racer.
He really wanted to be here. Yeah.
Yeah. And that means, the movie's doing something for every audience member. It's embracing those that already love and appreciate superhero films these days, but also those who are a little less receptive of them, that want something a bit more bold and daring and challenging. And this film is doing everything all at once. So just making the making the comparison back to that.
Done.
But yeah, thank you. I tried. Yeah, I totally thought of that one just in the past 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But yeah, the fact that there is this embrace, this exciting embrace for it. I'm just really interested to see where it goes and what conversation ensues from it.
Yeah.
And that's regardless of how I end up feeling about the movie. I'm so glad it exists in the way that it does, and that it took a chance, and it seems to be rewarded for that chance. So that is a really cool thing to see.
Yeah. I love this film so much. I've only seen it the one time, and I'm head over heels in love with this movie. So like we talked about earlier, I cannot wait to revisit this film, look at what I missed the first time around. And I mentioned in my opening thoughts that I have a few questions. Perhaps those will disappear on rewatches, even without getting to the third movie. We'll see how that goes. But even still, my criticisms of this film are so insignificant. And those questions that I do have, I don't think are really that much of a hindrance to this film. I absolutely love it. If this was to get a Best Picture nomination, I think it would be more than well deserved. If the Academy is going to nominate another animated film for Best Picture, and I agree with you, Brendan, I think at some point we will get to that again.
Yeah.
I think this could be it. Certainly, I feel like it's had the best opportunity in some time.
Yeah.
And I will transition from there. My last final thought. The Academy, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, look, I know that you don't have the same relationship with animated films as you do with horror. For whatever reason, you guys just don't like horror films. We could have that conversation at another time. You guys at least like animated movies. There's a whole category for animated movies. But also, you've nominated scores from animated movies. You've done it. You've awarded scores from animated movies before.
Michael Giacchino, baby. Michael Giacchino.
Absolutely. So, look, Daniel
Do it again.
is right there. Do it again. Like, yes, let's do this thing. You do like animated movies. This is one of the biggest films of the summer, of the entire year, most likely. This will have one of the best scores of the year. Let's do this thing. Whatever we got to do, let's nominate, maybe even award, Daniel Pemberton. For his score here. Come on, let's go.
I mean, will he get nominated? I don't know, but it's probably gonna go to John Williams for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, especially if it ends up being his final work as a composer.
Well, like we talked about this last year, because that was my argument for The Fabelmans. If he was going to win at the Oscars last year, look, this is going to be his last significant work, because
original work for sure.
Left,
I mean, at least nothing that recalls old themes that he may have already won awards for.
Right.
Exactly, because at that time, all he had left was Indiana Jones, and in my little mindscape, I didn't think that film had an opportunity to actually win, or maybe even be nominated for Best Original Score. But I don't know, if I'm being wholly cynical, you're probably right. Like, of course they're going to do that. And look, to be fair to John Williams, it might be great. I don't know yet. I haven't seen the film. I haven't heard the score, but it's John Williams. I should not doubt him. I just don't know if we should nominate John Williams every single time.
Now there are times like when he did some of those Star Wars sequels. I think at least the Force Awakens and the Last Jedi were worthy nominations at the very
Nominations,
least. So he certainly still has it in him. Maybe he'll surprise us with Dial of Destiny. But I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if the Legacy win goes in that direction for best original score.
And you're right. I mean, not even just The Last Jedi. Like, I loved his score for The Force Awakens, and that Rey theme, that was the first movie we heard it. It was like, why did I ever like?
It's one of the best themes from Star Wars.
Exactly. Like, took the words right out of my mouth. Like, one of the best themes in all of Star Wars. He does in 2015 or whenever that film came out. So like he has it in him. I'm not doubting him. It might be well deserved, but I don't know. There's a part of me that just thinks it's Indiana Jones. I don't foresee it, but I could be wrong. Who knows? And
who knows? Yeah.
Daniel Pemberton. That's the whole point of this conversation. Please nominate Daniel Pemberton, maybe even win. It's great. I absolutely love the music to this film.
Yep.
If you agree or disagree with any of our thoughts, you can hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can just leave a comment below this video.
Yeah.
We would certainly love to know your thoughts. Christian, thanks so much for joining us, my friend.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Man.
It's anytime, any chance. This is the year of the spider. Just to let you guys know, we got Across the Spider-Verse that's out now, and then because of Spider-Man 2 action on PlayStation 5, and that's gonna be awesome.
There you go.
Thank you guys
so
much for having me on. It was truly an honor. And I had a great time.
Yeah. Where can we find you on social media as well?
So you can find me over on Twitter and Instagram at Film Optics. That is Optics with an X. That is where we, talk all shop with movies. We always, talk JD and Brendan here on Twitter, just, chatting up all movie wise. So you can definitely follow us over there and check out our show, Film Optics Podcast as well.
Yeah, definitely go and check out the podcast. It's really great stuff. Be sure to give Christian a follow.
Yeah.
Always do appreciate it. Thanks for listening, everybody, or watching if you're joining us here on YouTube. Stay tuned for episode, what are we, 537, I believe it is. We're going to be doing
something like that.
So I've lost count.
What's a number?
I know. We're doing a Spider-Man retrospective, so we're going all in on all of the Spider-Man movies, so be on the lookout for that. Once again, thanks for listening, watching, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh my God, that movie's so good. So good.
Now I just want Spider Pig.
I know.